Okay, cool. We are now live. Perfect. Yeah. Okay, great. Cool. So there is a little bit of a delay, but we do have some people joining. So, all right, Kylene, do you want to get us started then?
Yeah, of course. Welcome, everybody. We'll start right away just because we have a lot of topics to cover and we want to have enough time to get your questions in. I'm hoping that there's a lot of curious people here tuning in today. But yes, welcome everybody to the New Year's resolution Compost More, Waste Less workshop hosted by the Lower East Side Ecology Center here in New York City. Just keep in mind that this is being streamed live on YouTube, which means it is also being recorded, just FYI. And yes, so our goals for this workshop is to get your New Year's resolution up and running tonight. That is our goal. And also just make you feel comfortable with taking on this New Year's resolution to begin with. So, all right, let's get on to introducing our presenters today. Jimmy, do we have the presentation up? Well, I just want to make sure that it's everybody can see it.
Yeah, coming in right now. Just give me 1 second.
And while everybody is waiting, feel free to share where you're tuning in from. We already have Susan from Davidson, North Carolina. Hello, thanks for being curious about how we compost here in New York City. Got some folks from Queens. Cool. All right, awesome. Yes, I can see our presentation here. So yes, let's get on to introducing your presenters for today, starting with myself. My name is Kylene Sanchez, and I am an outreach coordinator here for the Lower East Side Ecology Center. I've been working for the Ecology Center for about 2 years now, and currently I work with community groups and individuals to provide free and accessible composting opportunities, education, and support. So that includes this workshop as well. We also have Jimmy Costello here.
Hey y'all, this is Jimmy. Let me see if I can do a solo view for myself. Yes. Okay, cool. I do everything that Kylene just said. We have the same exact position. Love working with Kylene. Really happy with my position at the Ecology Center. And I'll also be doing the tech stuff tonight. So that being said, I'll pass it to our guest speaker, who is Belinda Chiu.
Thank you so much, Kylene and Jimmy. Welcome, everyone. I am very happy to be here. My name is Belinda Chiu, and I am a public health professional, environmental justice activist, and the sustainability content creator behind A Healthy Blueprint. I created this resource for individuals who are interested in low-impact living, and basically for anyone who is interested in becoming change makers in their communities. So very excited to be here today and wanted to thank the Lower East Side Ecology Center for inviting me to this workshop.
Thanks, Belinda. So just a quick note here. I met Belinda via Instagram during the height of the pandemic, the beginning of the shutdown, and I was extremely impressed with Belinda's dedication to composting. I was like, whoa, who is this person? She's really, really dedicated. Belinda, do you mind quickly explaining how your passion for composting and low impact living came about?
Yeah, definitely. So I first started composting when I had the chance to participate in the Brown Bin program or the Curbside Organics Collection program back when I was living in Elmhurst. And I learned that I could divert a huge amount of my waste from landfill because a large amount of that waste was actually consisting of food scraps and organics. So since that many years ago, I've been composting through the Brown Bin program. And then now since I relocated to a different neighborhood, I've been participating in dropping off my food scraps, which we'll be talking about later on in this presentation. In terms of my zero waste journey, I've had the privilege to be able to volunteer and work abroad. And I witnessed some of my community members and my neighbors burning trash, which made me realize that not many of us around the world have access to free sanitation services. So the only way that they can get rid of their trash, or the most convenient way, is by burning it. One of my goals was to personally reduce my own footprint through my everyday habits, which was kind of why I decided to create a healthy blueprint to document my own way of living and hopefully inspire others to do the same.
Well, I am very inspired already. Thanks, Belinda, for touching on that. So yeah, let's get on to the presentation. I'm going to start with our workshop agenda, what we're going to be going over today. So we're going to go over the history of the Lower East Side Ecology Center. If you're not familiar with it, we'll kind of give you an overview of what we're all about. We'll also touch on the basics of composting and why it's important. We're going to go over the NYC Compost Project program here in New York City, and what kind of composting opportunities we have here. And then we're also going to go over a New Yorker's step-by-step guide to drop-off composting. And then finally, we're going to get you situated on how to get involved here with our program and just the citywide program as a whole. And then hopefully we'll do our best to stay within our time frame and dedicate 10 to 15 minutes to answering your questions. So we highly encourage you to be curious, ask questions by utilizing the chat feature here on YouTube. So yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Jimmy, and he's going to get started on giving you a little spiel about the Lower East Side Ecology Center.
Cool. Yeah, and as a note, feel free to type your questions in the chat throughout. We will have like open floor at the end, but if you have it now, just so we don't want you to forget your question, so just type it in the chat. All right, so a little bit about the history of the Lower East Side Ecology Center. So the Lower East Side Ecology Center, we are an environmental nonprofit, and we have been pioneering community recycling since 1987. So on the left, you have a picture of our founder, Christina Das Romero. In the photo, she's showing off some of the paper and plastics that the Lower East Side Ecology Center had collected. And the reason that she was collecting them was because at the time, the city of New York actually was not even recycling, did not have a curbside recycling program like it does today. So today, every house and also every residential, every residence is able to put out their paper and plastic for recycling curbside. It's picked up. It's very convenient. But at the time, it wasn't an option. So she was kind of pioneering in that sense. And although we started with paper and plastic, kind of the recyclables, we also returned to recycling food scraps. So the New York Times actually did a feature of the Lower East Side Ecology Center. The image on the right is a scan of the New York Times feature from 1995. So it's safe to say that we have a pretty good track history of pioneering recycling of material, whether it be kind of the quote unquote recyclables that we think of today or food scraps. And just one fun fact about the Ecology Center, with the Union Square Green Market, FSDO, or Food Scrap Drop-Off, that is the longest standing organics and food scraps collection spot in NYC history, and that is run and operated by the Lower East Side Ecology Center. So just kind of a fun fact, something that we're proud of. All right, so a little bit more about the Ecology Center today. We have 4 kind of program areas. The first one that we'll talk about, and the main one that we'll be discussing today, is also our largest. It is our compost collection. So the picture is just someone dropping off their food scraps at one of our food scrap drop-offs. I actually am pretty sure that that is the Union Square, which is like the oldest one. We also do environmental education. So pictured is one of our educators giving a workshop with a class of students. And then we also have e-waste collection. So we have events regularly, especially during the spring and summer, all throughout the city, where we collect folks' e-waste so that it doesn't go to landfill, and then it can be upcycled into something else. And also, lastly, we have stewardship. So pictured is 4 people working in East River Park. So what we do there is we invite New Yorkers to really get their hands dirty, and we give them our guidance, and we provide them with best practices of how they can take care of the parklands that they may live near. So these are the 4 main areas of focus that the Ecology Center works with. But like I said, the largest one, and the one that we'll be talking about mostly today, is composting. So Kylene will get us started with the basics of compost.
Thank you, Jimmy, for giving us an insight on the Ecology Center. So in the next few slides, I'm going to go over the composting basics and kind of simplify the understanding of the composting process, as I think most of us that are here today are probably beginners. So although we're going to get a little sciencey, we'll probably also keep a little bit more simplified, easily, and digestible too. So we're going to start off by answering the burning question, what is compost? But also identify key terms we use when describing compost as well. So the first one, we have decomposition. Most of us have seen this in our everyday lives. For example, when leaves start to fall and coat the ground around our trees, in our parks, when we leave it undisturbed, those leaves are being decomposed by Mother Nature. And then we have organics, which refers to any material that was once living or is currently living. We have composting, and the key word here is human managed. By managing the compost system, composters are able to decompose organic matter into compost at a much, much faster rate, rather than, in nature, Mother Nature doing that in the wild. And then we have compost itself. So compost is the finished material used for horticultural purposes. We call that a soil amendment. It's a dark and crumbly material that also has like that type of earthy smell to it. This product is also stabilized to a point at which it is beneficial to plant growth, aka a soil amendment. And what I have kind of highlighted here is that compost is not soil. I find that a lot of people like to switch between both, and that can get really confusing, but compost and soil are two different things. Soil is made up of 50% pore space, and then the rest of that 50% are minerals and organic matter, which aka can be compost. Healthy soil can support a wide variety or diversity of plant life, while compost itself can't really do that. You need other minerals and other materials to support that plant life. You can go to the next slide. Cool. And now that we've kind of defined those key terms, we're going to go into how compost is actually made. How do we go from that picture on the left slide, your organic matter, your food scraps, to what we have on the picture on the right, which is our finished compost? Well, so organic matter can be processed in many different ways. Some examples include worm composting, which a lot of people are familiar with. That's also called vermicomposting. Some people think of composting as like a fermentation, a Japanese method called bokashi. Today, we're going to be focused on aerobic composting, meaning composting that relies on oxygenic conditions. You can go to the next slide. Cool. So now we're identifying what aerobic composting is. And the reason why we're focusing on that today is because this method of composting is a very appropriate method for an urban setting, hence why most community composters like us, we do it this way. So this type of composting has many benefits, including a fast process. Like I said before, composting is a rapid process as opposed to decomposition, which happens naturally. For us at the Lower East Side Ecology Center, it could take between 9 to 12 months for organics to fully decompose. As in nature, it could take a couple of years, maybe even longer to do that. Another benefit is that it controls smells. So a lot of people have this notion that all compost is smelly. Well, that's not necessarily true, because in an aerobic system, it introduces oxygen, which draws out the moisture. And this moisture is what causes that putrid smell. Third, it kills pathogens and weeds. So this aerobic process produces heat. And this heat is a byproduct of the microbial breakdown of organic material. And because it has the ability to kill all these things that we don't want in the final product, it makes it a much more reliable and safe product to use for our urban environments and even when we're growing food. And lastly, it also minimizes methane production. Jimmy will dive into this soon, but composting food scraps actually avoids the production of methane. And this potent greenhouse gas is actually produced in landfills. When we're composting, it does the complete opposite, which is really good. So how do we keep this composting process aerobic? I'll answer that in the next slide. So Jimmy, you can, the next one, awesome. So what does it take to compost aerobically? Community composters are creative, but each system considers these 5 factors that lay down the building blocks to successful composting. So the first one, we have our feedstock. So feedstock is another name for ingredients, which can be your food scraps, your grass clippings, anything that has been freshly used, as we consider greens, aka the nitrogen-rich material. Feedstocks also include browns, which are your carbon-rich materials. So this is your like woody leaves or bark, sawdust, anything that would take much longer to break down. This is getting into a little bit more of the sciencey aspect, but for community composters, the ideal ratio for your system is 25 to 30 parts brown to 1 part green. So as you can tell that you need a lot of browns to supplement the green, because the greens are what's causing kind of more moisture development, which means you'll get more smells. So we always want to pack in our system with browns. Next slide, please. All right, and then you have the rest of the 5 factors. So the second factors to consider when composting is moisture. Like I said before, we don't want too much moisture or too little moisture. Again, sciencey, but a system should have between 40 to 60% moisture by weight. In simpler terms, if you were to take your system, like a handful of organic matter and squeeze it, it should have the same moisture as a wrung out sponge. We'll also need sufficient oxygen levels. That should be about 10% depending on the size of your system. And number 4, not a lot of people think about this, but actually the size of your ingredients matters too. Ingredients of a smaller size will of course decompose much quicker than larger ones. This is because there's more surface area and less density for those microorganisms to colonize on. So folks at home, make sure you're chopping down your food scraps. And then number 5, we have the size and shape of the system. So that's really important too, is to consider like how much feedstock that you have and how much space you have. So size and shape are really, really important as well. So when all of these factors are in perfect harmony, we call these ideal conditions. We're actually building the perfect home for microbial activity. Next slide, please. Cool, thanks. So that microbial activity is basically what these critters are doing, right? What you're looking at here are the workers of a compost system. So composting is not only human managed, but it's also extremely biological, meaning that it's alive. What we see on the surface may be organic matter, but when we look deeper, there's a complex web of micro and macro organisms that are actually working really hard to compost your food scraps. They're the ones that make the magic happen, and it's our jobs as humans to basically make them happy and give them a good working environment. If you want to learn more about the compost food web, you can take a look at this tip sheet from New York City Compost Project. I'm commenting that in the chat room right now. Actually, I can't comment that, but Jimmy, if you have the ability to comment this tip sheet, that would be awesome.
Yep, sure thing.
Otherwise, I can pass it on to you, Jimmy, to move on to why we compost in the first place.
Cool. Yep. All right. Just put that link in the chat, so feel free to check it out if you are interested. So Kylene gave us a lot of information about how specifically compost works, what happens in the bin, and the real question that I asked myself after I watched those slides is, okay, but we have some people who are joining the call, New Year's resolution, maybe they're totally new to this. Why would you want to compost to begin with, let alone all these nitty-gritty details, like why should someone be diverting their food scraps from the landfill? Why should I be taking on this additional work? Why are we all on this call? Why does the city of New York fund this work, et cetera, et cetera? So there are tons of different options. The first one that I usually bring up, and personally the reason that I became interested and involved in composting, is to send less waste to the landfill. So on the right hand side, I have an image. It is part of the 2017 NYC residential waste profile. So this was essentially a massive waste audit that the city did in 2017. Just please note that it is residential, so it doesn't include like any businesses or universities. So we have a couple of key percentages. The section that's shown in orange is approximately 34% of the total charge. So that's approximately 34% of all of the waste that was seen that year. And 34% of the waste was identified as suitable for composting. So within that 34%, we see approximately 21% of them were food scraps. So that's a huge number to me. I think that's really valuable to know that 1 in 5 um, kind of pounds of garbage processed by the city are actually food scraps. 8% of it was food soiled paper. So a classic example of this would be if you order pizza and when it comes, it's kind of greasy, so like it couldn't be recycled, but it is eligible for composting in the right conditions. And then additional 8% was yard waste. This would be things like grass clippings, or if you had a tree fall, something like that, or if you have a plant that's died. So if there's one thing that you take away from this workshop, I hope that you take away this, is that it's not waste until you waste it. So if there's one thing that you like walk away with, I hope that you kind of can change your perception of food scraps and these browns or yard materials, yard waste, as not waste, but actually a really, really valuable resource that can be upcycled into something much more useful than just being sent to landfill. So specifically, we have this video here showing some of the application of our finished compost. So the video is actually from the Lower East Side at one of our events. We were doing a street tree care event, and you can see that we have one of our volunteers. He's applying the finished compost. It's just a single bag, and he's applying it to the street tree bed. You can see it's kind of dark, it's mulchy, it's really, really a valuable soil amendment. So just keep in mind the scale here. This is only one volunteer, it's one bag, and it was processed at our site, which is kind of small to medium size. But you can imagine that as organics collection expands, whether it be throughout the city or throughout the entire country, so does the opportunity to use that finished compost. So not only are we removing these things from the landfill, but we're also putting them towards a really, really valuable use. And I'm going to exit this now. Sorry, having a hard time exiting this. Okay. All right, so Kylene kind of hinted towards this previously, but one of the most important things, in my opinion, about composting, especially when we talk about it at the big scale, is climate mitigation. So when we send our food scraps to a landfill, they break down anaerobically, meaning that they don't have proper access to oxygen. So the first issue here is that it's very stinky. It is smells really gross. But kind of in a more serious note, the methane emissions that are released during anaerobic decomposition are anywhere from 70 to 84 more in the short term. They are anywhere from 70 to 84 more times more having more of a global warming potential than carbon dioxide, which is the most common greenhouse gas metric. So you might hear people talk about carbon emissions, this, that, and the other, carbon emissions from cars or airplanes. Carbon stays in the environment for longer, but in the short term, methane actually has a far, far more potent effect on climate change. And that is something so it's a very actionable item that we have if we wanted to reduce climate change and mitigate its effects. On a more positive note, though, reducing food waste is a wonderful way to build community. So this graphic is from ILSR, the Institute for Local and Self-Reliance. And essentially what we're trying to show you here is that food waste reduction and community truly go hand in hand. And this graphic highlights a lot of the harmonies between waste reduction, specifically of food, and how that can lead to you kind of becoming more friendly with your neighbors. So just for everyone's reference, the Lower East Side Ecology Center, we fall kind of between this small scale decentralized and medium scale local. That's essentially the scale that we're operating at. So just if as you're thinking about the Ecology Center, that's where we land. And then my last note is about healthy soil and how the soils benefit our society. So as we saw in the video, and as Kylene also described, soil is an incredibly valuable soil amendment. And city dwellers, we may not always be thinking about the soil underneath us, but it's actually a really important, dare I say, the base for our society. So adding compost increases the soil's fertility, which means that plants can grow more easily. It also reduces soil erosion, meaning it literally keeps things where they are. Soil is also able to store carbon in it, which helps to protect the climate and again is a climate change mitigation. So rather than releasing methane in the landfill, the compost is actually used as a carbon sink and absorbs the greenhouse gas emissions. Also relating to stormwater, healthy soil that has been treated with compost is shown to grab excess stormwater so that it doesn't end up in our waterways, and it also filters that stormwater. So all in all, there's so many reasons, and I think each of these points deserves a presentation in its own, honestly, but all in all, what I mean to say is that there are many, many motivations for New Yorkers to be composting more and more. And one of the key networks that is currently making composting happening in New York is the New York City Compost Project, which we'll talk a little bit more about now.
Thank you, Jimmy. Amazing. I just want to remind everybody that's watching that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments section. That's going to be the easiest way that we can answer it at the end of our presentation. But in the meantime, let's go into what the NYC Compost Project is and what type of programs we offer. So the New York City Compost Project is a citywide initiative that was created by the Department of Sanitation in 1993. Us at the Lower East Side Ecology Center have been a part of the New York City Compost Project since 2003. And overall, the project helps reduce waste in New York City and with the goal of rebuilding the city's soils by giving New Yorkers the knowledge, the skills and opportunities they need to produce and use compost locally. As you can see here, we are not the only ones that are part of this project. We also have 6 other partners that do the same things as us. So if you're not in the Manhattan borough, that's where we are, you can definitely explore these other organizations and see if they have any type of workshops or learning opportunities that are near you. As you can see here, I've also included Grow NYC, which is not a Compost Project partner, but we work extremely close with them because they're amazing and they host so many food scrap drop-off sites throughout all 5 boroughs, and their compost program has excelled in providing accessibility to all New Yorkers. And then now I'm going to get into our program offerings. All right, here is our 4 main offerings. Of course, we do a lot of other things, but these are kind of our 4 big ones. So the first one is obviously local compost opportunities in New York City. If you take a look at the map on the right, that is basically the citywide hub of where you can find some sites near you. So that's going to be, Jimmy, if you want to actually share that in the chat, that'd be awesome. So far, we have over 200 sites citywide, which is amazing because at the height of the pandemic, when everything shut down, we had 0, or little to 0 at least. So now we're up to 200. We also have local processing sites, which means that your food scraps are not being hauled all the way to a different state. It's being processed right here in New York City. And that, because that's being produced here, you can also buy and use and get compost donated locally to you. We also have outreach and education. So that includes workshops like this one. We'll touch on this soon, but there's also a Master Composter Certificate course, which trains future compost leaders in advanced topics of science, soil science and composting. And then lastly, we also provide technical support. So not only are we partnering with individuals, but also community partners, such as community gardens, to build composting systems and train volunteers. And now that we've kind of touched on the program as a whole, Jimmy's going to go on and talk about different composting opportunities here.
Cool. Thank you so much. And I see there is a question, so we will definitely talk about that at the end. Karen, thanks for your question. All right, so I'm going to set you up with essentially 3 different categories of composting. We're going to talk about at home, drop off, and pickup. So at home is the first one that I'm going to talk about. I want to highlight that it can be done in either an apartment or a backyard. I feel like it's a kind of a common misconception that you need to have like some really huge backyard in order to compost at home. But pictured on the right, we actually have a worm bin, which is a really fun, if you have kids, they love worms, and it is super, super small scale. That worm bin is probably no more than like 2 feet by 1 foot, maybe like 3 feet by 1 foot, can even be smaller than that. So worm bins, aka vermicomposting, is one option. I'm not going to get into like the nitty gritty on any of these, but just know that it is an option for you. And then pictured at left is a 3-bin system. So this is like pretty common. This would be one of the larger options for a backyard system. You could also do something like a tumbler. You could have a simple bin. You could even just like make a small pile in your backyard if that's what you wanted to do. Other things, if you are interested, we're not going to talk about them in detail, but other options include bokashi, and even just using a cardboard box. So long story short, you can do it at home, whether you live in an apartment or at a backyard. So kind of the pro of processing your own compost at home is that you can drop it off anytime. There's no worrying about if the hours are convenient or if you have to travel there. It's also going to be highly educational, so you are going to learn so much about science, soil, decomposition, and all of these things. And of course, the big one is that you get to harvest all of that finished compost that you've made. So you can use it however you want. You can use it in your garden. You can donate it to a community garden that you care about, or you can give it to a friend or family. And then the con is going to be that this is kind of the most work, and it's also the most hands-on. So if you're not someone that wants to get your hands dirty, this is probably not the option for you. The next is probably the most common for most New Yorkers that are engaged in composting, and it's kind of a middle of the road option, is dropping off your food scraps at an FSDO or food scrap drop off. So this is kind of medium amount of work where you have to bring your food scraps to the FSDO, and it's kind of medium reward because you might get to know them a little bit, and maybe one day they'll give you some compost back if you're lucky. And like I said, as of right now, amongst people who are composting in New York, this is probably the most common option. So on the left, we have that same photo from before at our Union Square FSDO. And on the right-hand side, I wanted to highlight, this is just a sign from a community garden showing that they're not like some big operation, but they are processing compost on site. So you could drop off with a community garden as well. And then the last, and perhaps the most convenient option, would be to have your compost picked up. So we have two images here. The one on the left is a micro hauler, which we'll talk a little bit about, and then the one on the right is the DSNY curbside composting program. So if you have the option, or if you decide to do a pickup style composting, like I said, it's kind of going to be the most convenient because they will do most of the work for you physically. You don't have to haul anything. However, you're not going to learn very much about composting or soil, and it's not going to be super rewarding because you're not necessarily going to get any of the compost back. Sometimes you have to pay for it, et cetera, et cetera. So if you are interested in a micro hauler, I have a couple. I'm going to put the links in the chat when I'm done speaking. There are 3 that we want to shout out just because we know them: BK Rod, Reclaimed Organics, and Ground Cycle. Those are all common in New York, and there are some others I'm sure as well. So I'll put the links in the chat for all of those. And I'm also going to put a link in the chat later on for the DSNY curbside composting program. It's currently at the neighborhood scale, so all of you and your neighbors have to opt in, and if enough people in your neighborhood opt in, then you can be added to the route and you can receive a brown bin. So these are kind of your 3 options. And because food scrap drop-offs and drop-off composting is so common in New York City, Belinda is going to dive deeper to the specific guide of dropping off in NYC.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jimmy. So let's talk about a New Yorker's guide to dropping off compost or your food scraps. First, we're going to talk about where you can drop off your food scraps. As Kylene had mentioned before, there are over 200 drop-off sites in the 5 boroughs, which makes it really easy for New Yorkers to keep their food scraps out of landfills. There are a few ways that you can locate a food scrap drop-off site that is convenient for you. As you can see on the slide here, you can either use the DSNY's map or the community crowdsourced food scrap drop-off tracker to help you locate some potential sites. Both of these resources are chock full of information on the days and the times residents are able to drop them off, different intersections as to where exactly the bins are located, as well as additional details specific to the site. I do want to mention and acknowledge the fact that there are people who are joining us from outside of New York City or outside of New York State, and people even joining us from Australia. So I want to shout out the resources Share Waste and Make Soil, which we'll also share in the resources following this presentation as other resources where you can locate your drop-off sites in your neighborhood. So moving on, let's talk about what items are accepted or not accepted at your food scrap drop-off site. So food scraps from drop-off sites are processed at different facilities based on who is hosting the site. It's really important for you to take a moment to find out what is accepted at your local drop-off site. So typically, a good rule of thumb that you can remember is that fruit and vegetables will be accepted, and animal products such as meat, dairy, bones, fish, seafood, etc. will not be accepted. On this slide, you can see what can and can't be composted at the Lower East Side Ecology Center. So as we mentioned, every facility has their own set of rules. So if you're happening to be dropping off at a location that's not operated by the Ecology Center, these listed items may not apply. So I do encourage you to check out the DSNY page or the food scrap drop-off tracker just to see what items are listed that are accepted at the drop-off site. Moving on, we'll talk about what happens when things that don't belong end up in the compost pile. So Kylene and Jimmy, since you work at the Ecology Center, I'd like to ask you, what are some items that you found that couldn't be composted at the compost pile?
One funny one, there's so many that come in. One really funny one, I was visiting another New York City compost project site, the Queens Botanic Garden. I was doing a workday with them, and someone, I guess, I'm pretty sure it was by accident, I don't think it was malicious, but they had dropped in an entire knife. It was a serrated knife. It wasn't really that wasn't that sharp, but lots of different materials come in that are essentially do not belong, and we have to filter them out by hand. So that's just one of the more funny and kind of obtuse examples.
Kylene, what about you? What's the strangest thing you found?
Oh man, there's a lot of numbers or a lot of things that have come up. One of the funny ones I've seen is a pair of underwear. I don't know why they're in there. I've also seen knives. I've also seen credit cards. So unfortunately, to those that have lost their credit cards, they're not going to be used, but they're being lost in the pile. But seriousness aside, a lot of the common things that we find that don't belong are actually produce stickers, twist ties, rubber bands, those little things that you just like, they're just there. You just forget about it and just throw it in. They can actually pile up. We see a lot of that and cause more harm than good. It can make the final product more contaminated, right? And we'll sometimes have to pick all that out by hand. So there also is a lot of time and resources dedicated to removing those contaminants.
Yeah, I definitely hear you on that. I do want to say that I've had some confusion and difficulty and I guess challenges when it comes to composting for myself when it comes to packaging labels. So a lot of times when we're getting takeout, for example, or if we are going to a food court, there are places that like to have their takeout containers or their utensils in compostable packaging. What do we do about that? What's a good gold standard, or what are some recommendations that you would share with people who are joining us today?
I can take a stab at that one. So the Ecology Center, like Jimmy said before, we operate on a community scale. So we're not this huge composter like like Department of Sanitation, they take in a lot of waste. We're not to that scale. We're still very small. So I'd say anything that is labeled as compostable, first of all, I would double check that, because here in the US, we look for a certification that actually tells us that this product has been tested and it is certified that can break down within 18 months. So what we're looking for is a BPI products or BPI certification, which is basically the Bioproducts Institute. For us at the Ecology Center, because we are smaller scale, we can only take small, soft compostable plastics. More of that like hard compostable plastics, like
the utensils, right?
Utensils, cups. That is just considered another contaminant for us, unfortunately. If you have curbside collection that's being taken out of New York City, I would say that's a little bit more lenient. You can put compostable plastics in there, but again, you have to double check that certification.
Thanks so much. If there's nothing else, I know that there's a lot of questions coming in, and I'm sorry that not all of us can jump into the chat right now. For some reason, we were having some technical difficulties, but we'll try to get to all of them close to the end of the presentation. But for now, let's move on to talk about storage and dropping off food scraps. Before I go on, I'd love for anyone who does have their own tips on how you're storing food scraps and the ways that you're carrying your food scraps before you drop them off. Feel free to share it in the chat and share it with anyone who's joining us today. So I actually had my sister go to the kitchen and share how we are storing our food scraps at home. But I want to share that the way that you can collect and store your food scraps at home to kind of minimize any kind of mess and odors is you can store them in the refrigerator in containers. So depending on what kind of space you have, you can store them in paper bags in your freezer or plastic containers with lids in the refrigerator. So what I typically do and what we do on our floor is whenever I'm doing any kind of food preparation, I'll have a plastic container that basically just like a Chinese takeout container. I'm chopping up any vegetables or preparing fruit. And as I have any scraps, I'm just putting it into this container. And when it gets full, I'll just slap a lid on it and then put it into the fridge until I'm ready to drop it off at the drop-off site that I typically go to. During this process, I know that someone in the chat had mentioned right when they get home, they immediately take off any stickers or any other potential contaminants, which is a great practice. I typically do that too whenever I'm doing any kind of food preparation. So when it comes to produce stickers, twist ties, any kind of rubber bands, I'll try to remove that immediately right before I'm doing any kind of preparation or any kind of storage. That way I don't have to deal with it when I'm dropping them off later. So since this is a New Year's resolution style workshop, I wanted to ask Kylene or Jimmy, if you have a roommate or a family member who has a New Year's resolution and wants to start composting and it's very new to them, what would be a tip that you would give them so that they can kind of be on the right track and compost the right way in your household?
Sure, yeah, I think there are two that I usually give. The first, and I think it was Karen, she has a practical question. Any tips on keeping compostables in my kitchen until drop off without them getting stinky or attracting bugs? I will never forget when I first started composting about 5 or 6 years ago. It was my freshman year of college, and I had left some of my compostable materials in a sealed plastic bin, probably about yay big, underneath the sink for, let's say, a week or two. And when I opened it, when I tell you, it reeked to high heaven. Yet here I am still working in compost. So obviously something changed. The main thing that changed for me was I discovered putting your food scraps in the freezer, which honestly, if there is one tip that I can give anyone that wants to compost, this is absolutely it. It makes everything so much more convenient, so much cleaner. It does not smell at all. And then also, even as you're carrying your food scraps, I like to bring them in a plastic bag personally, and they stay frozen, so it still doesn't even stink as you're moving. And then the second one that I would have is that wherever you're bringing your food scraps to, I know a lot of people bring to an FSDO or food scrap drop off. just because the FSDO, just because there's one that's located near you, doesn't actually mean that it's going to be the most convenient. So, for example, personally, there's a community garden that is maybe 3 blocks from my apartment. So it's just like a 5-minute walk. And you would think that that's the most convenient one. But in reality, the FSDO that I normally use is when I commute to our office, there's one there because the hours are much more convenient for me versus the one that's located near my house. The hours actually don't align with my schedule. So those are my 2 tips: is A, absolutely get it into the freezer, and B, just because an FSDO, a food scrap drop-off site, is located near you doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be the most convenient. So you should definitely check out ones that are like along your commuting path as well, because that can actually be the easiest.
Those are some great tips. Thank you for sharing, Jimmy. Kylene, do you have any tips you want to share?
Yeah, quickly for me, I would say that I can be a forgetful person. So I love sticky notes. So I like one of the persons in the comment said they take out their stickers right away. That's something that I put on my compost bin, make sure to take off my stickers. And then when I was living with roommates, I would actually put a postcard of what can and cannot be composted also on my container, just so everybody's on the same page, including like my local garden. I just put those hours on there just so that everybody knows what's going on. It's a lot smoother process than everybody forgetting and putting a bone in my compost. So yeah.
That's also a really great tip. Thank you for sharing. Right before we move on to the next slide, I do want to talk about how you're transporting your food scraps to your local drop-off site. So Jimmy had mentioned that because he freezes his food scraps, he's able to transport it in a plastic bag. You can basically use whatever vessel you want. So if you are in the brown bin program, you might have gotten a plastic bucket that you see in the bottom left-hand corner, or you might use any other vessel that is convenient for you. One thing that I would recommend is if you're using a plastic bag, for example, you don't want to drop off your food scraps with the plastic bag. Just make sure you're taking your container with you to avoid any kind of potential contaminants. So the last thing that I'll talk about before I pass it back to the Lower East Side Ecology team is some best practices when dropping off your food scraps. I would encourage you to follow the site's guidelines. So first of all, you want to make sure that you're dropping off during the site's operating hours, and make sure that you're not leaving any of the scraps during the site's closed hours. So don't leave the scraps at the site when it's not open. This will kind of minimize any issues with any pests or unwanted animals that would be around to like dig open your bags or whatever and leave it as an unpleasant site. You want to make sure that you're dropping off only the materials that they accept. So as I mentioned before, what we shared earlier in the slides are what is accepted with the Ecology Center, but may not be accepted at your specific site that you go to. You want to leave the site in the condition that you found it or better. So for example, if you're dropping off your food scraps and a piece of lettuce falls on the ground, don't leave the lettuce there. Just pick it up and drop it off as well. And then a bonus, if you're dropping off your food scraps with a paper bag, paper bags are accepted, but one thing that you could do is shred up the paper bag. And also, if you have the time, chop off your food scraps before dropping them off. That way, as Kylene mentioned, it's increasing the surface area and then accelerating the breakdown process. And now I will pass it back to Kylene and Jimmy.
Thank you, Belinda. You summarized so many things so efficiently. So I'm so happy to have you here. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit specifically about how you can actually get involved, whether it's composting itself or getting involved with the Lower East Side Ecology Center, the New York City Compost Project, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing that obviously I hope that you do is to actually start composting. Like I said, I gave you the 3 kind of buckets. You can compost at home, you can get a worm bin set up, you can do a bin build, you can buy a tumbler, you can buy a bin, you can just make a pile. You also can participate at a drop-off, which we got, I think you have a pretty thorough explanation by now, or you can enroll in a pickup, whether it's paid or unpaid. That being said, we have 3 other things that I'll recommend. These are all specific to the NYC Compost Project or the Ecology Center. So here we have our New York City Master Composter is relaunching for the spring. Very, very, very exciting, highly anticipated, lots of kind of commotion about this. I don't have an exact date right now, but definitely within the next 6 months, you will see that going live. Um, and we also have an interest form that I'll be putting the link in the chat so you can kind of be the first to know. Another way to be on to have the insider scoop is to follow us on Eventbrite. Most of the people who are tuning in, I believe that you were registered via Eventbrite. That's a really good way to be the first to know when we have a new workshop. And as you can see, these events are 2 out of the 3 are already sold out. We do sell out our events very regularly. We try to limit them so that we don't have too many people involved so we can offer everyone a good experience. So if you follow us on Eventbrite, you'll be the first to know. And then another way to kind of stay in the know is to subscribe to our newsletter. I'll be putting links for all 3 of these in the chat on YouTube. Our newsletter, you can see more like other opportunities and jobs. You can also like read articles. You can also see volunteer days or workshops. So if you want to volunteer with us and really learn more in that way, we would love to see you. So those are just 3 that, and I'll follow up with links right now.
Thanks, Jimmy. I'm also going to be talking about another way to get involved. Honestly, I think it's one of the best ways is to actually start volunteering and be a compost volunteer. Funny enough, this is exactly how I initially became interested in composting, is just going out of my comfort zone, trying new things, and looks like I fell in love. But so organizations and community groups who are managing compost programs are most likely not nonprofits like us, or they're volunteer run, meaning obviously they don't get paid. So the help of volunteers is extremely valuable and an awesome hands-on experience while helping to keep these programs running. So a few examples include obviously the Compost Project. All of our partners have volunteer days. If you're interested, let us know. Post-workshop, we can give you some resources. You can also volunteer at a community garden. The best way to find out what's close to you is actually on Green Thumb's kind of garden map. And this is most likely volunteer run. And then if you are really encouraged to express why you love composting and why it's important, you can volunteer at Grow NYC. They have awesome ways to reach your own community and neighbors and have them start composting. And then lastly, we're going to pass on to Belinda, another way you can get involved.
Thank you, Kylene. So this is another way you can get involved. It's last but certainly not least, advocate for composting in New York City. So I know that a lot of us who are joining today are New York City residents or newly New York City residents. So you might be familiar with Save Our Compost, which is what I'm here to talk about. If you don't already have Curbside Organics Collection in your neighborhood, or also known as the Brown Bin Program, this is your chance that you can sign up, whether you are a resident in a house or in an apartment building. This is your chance to let the DSNY know that you are very interested in having it in your neighborhood so it can be serviced in your neighborhood. You want to show demand so that they will eventually bring the program to your neighborhood. Additionally, composting, as Jimmy had mentioned, is an essential form of climate action, and we want to demonstrate that to our elected officials. We do encourage you to reach out to them and let them know how interested you are in composting and how much you want them to support any kind of legislation or any kind of budget, such as the city budget, when it comes to composting program, any kind of policies or legislation that will be coming up regarding any kind of composting initiatives. Yep, and that's it for me. I think we are wrapping it up now, and I know that there are some questions in the chat. So I know Jimmy has been scanning the chat throughout this presentation, so I'll turn it back to Jimmy.
Cool. Yeah, why don't I go ahead and read some of them, and then either Kylene or Belinda can answer. So the first one, I think that we answered already. It was about any tips on keeping compostables in my kitchen until drop off without getting stinky or attracting bugs. I would say freezing is huge. Any other advice?
Yeah, I would say if you have access, especially in the winter time, if you have access to a balcony or a fire escape, it's so cold that it serves as extra space and it's cold enough to store your food scraps. And I don't think that there'd be much issues. I would say that's also another avenue for storing your food scraps until you drop them off.
Very creative, yes. All right, the next question is from Gia. What is the name of the small apparatus for apartment composting? Where can I buy it? Um, I'm not sure specifically what they're getting at. I'm wondering if they mean like the storage bin or if they mean the specific composting system. So, Kylene, maybe do you want to answer for both? The question is, what is the name of the small apparatus for apartment composting and where can I buy it?
Yeah, I think maybe they were referring to either vermicomposting, bokashi, or kind of the cardboard box method. Do you think, Jimmy, that's what they were talking about?
Yes, or the other answer would be that just like a place to store your food scraps. It really can be any container. Personally, I like a plastic bag because then after I drop off at the FSDO, the plastic bag just like goes in my backpack or something like that, so I can like break it down. But yeah, you can talk about vermicompost and the other kind of apartment size compost processing systems.
Yeah, totally. If we're talking about at home vermicomposting, that is basically a form of composting with worms. So you're looking for red wiggler worms to do the work for you. A great place to source those worms is Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. I don't know, Jimmy, if you can add that into the chat.
Yes, I got
But
you.
that's like honestly one of the most reliable sources that we have to getting worms. In terms of bokashi, that is a form of fermentation, and that's actually a two-step process. So you have the fermentation of food scraps, and then in order to do bokashi, you either need a composting system, like a pile, or you need an open space where you can dig a trench. So that one's a little bit more work. But in order to start doing like the fermentation processes, you basically need the EM liquid, which is effective microbes. That's something that you can buy online. And then you would need some sort of wheat. A lot of folks already have that mixture that you can just buy. And some folks even have like a kit. So all of this you can have ready made for you.
Cool.
I hope that
Thank you.
helps.
The next one is from Claire. Are all of the FSDOs run by partners of the New York City Compost Project? I wonder if quote unquote private companies also collect organic waste. Kylene, do you want to answer?
Yeah. If you want to go on to the DSNY website, the map that Jimmy shared, the one that has over 200 sites, the quick answer is no. Not all drop-offs are run by the New York City Compost Project, but a lot of them are run by community gardens. So volunteer-run groups that are working really hard to work and divert these food scraps in their own neighborhoods. So we even have like the small groups doing the awesome work. In terms of private companies collecting organic waste, I'm wondering if like Ground Cycle is considered like a private company, right? Something that you have to pay for. We have Reclaimed Organics, which is a small company. Both of those are small companies that by using their service, you are supporting their small business. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and also it's important to know that some of the FSDOs operate totally on their own. So there are community gardens that they are so knowledgeable, they have so many volunteers. We applaud them so sincerely. We absolutely love you. Um, like for example, La Plaza Cultural and also El Brother Sister Soul. That's just like two examples that are off the top of my head. Um, so they are processing all of their food scraps on their own. And then there's also FSDOs that are community gardens where they're trying and they're doing a really, really awesome job, but there's so much interest and there's so many food scraps that they need help processing the excess. So for example, the Lower East Side Ecology Center or another New York City compost project host, we might help them by hauling. So we might take away some of the excess. And then there are also FSDOs that are run completely by compost project hosts. So for example, there are sites that are it's just a toter on the street. That's all that we do. We put out a bin, we put it there for 4 hours a week. We do some outreach for it, and that's that. So there's kind of no community partner. So you can have fully community hosted with help, or you can be fully operated by a compost project partner. All right, the next question that I'm seeing
Jimmy,
is
right before you jump into the next question, I do want to shout out someone who doesn't really fit into the community garden space or New York City Compost Project, but Astoria Pug has been doing phenomenal work ever since the beginning of the pandemic. So want to shout Astoria Pug. I don't know if Lou and Karen are on the line today, but if they are, many thanks to you both and for Rocky the Pug for all their work that they've done for the past 2 years. So yeah.
Yes, I saw that they were registered, but I don't know if they made it.
Oh.
Okay, the next question is from Juju. Can you please talk about why the shape and size of the storage matters, and what shape and size would be the ideal condition? So I think that this question is kind of getting at two things. The first is about why the shape and size of the feedstock when it's being the food scrap when it's being stored is important, and then the second is what are the ideal conditions for a compost pile. So maybe I'll answer the first one and you'll answer the second one, Kylene. Okay, sure. So the first question, why do the shape and size of the food scraps in storage matter? So essentially what it comes down to is, and I think that Belinda kind of like nodded her hat to this, so thank you so much for that. Is that when we take in material that is huge, like let's say, for example, there was an entire watermelon, or not too long ago, we had a bunch of pumpkins coming in. The material, the green is so large and the surface area is so kind of contained that it's not really broken up. So it takes much longer for that material to actually break down in the bin. So something that if you come to our Union Square drop off, we have, say, 8 toters open, and during our downtime, we will be taking a chopper to break open all of the food scraps. So a good rule of thumb is that it should be like smaller than your hand. That would be the ideal. You should definitely be able to pick anything up with one hand. So, for example, like a broccoli stalk, sometimes they can be kind of big. So that's a good example. And just essentially, the smaller the better. But roughly the size of your hand would be like a good rule of thumb. And then the other question is about what are the ideal conditions, shape and size for a compost processing system.
Yeah, so when we're talking about a compost system, there is, like I said before, composters get creative. But when we're talking about aerobic composting, which our goal is to make sure that the compost pile is hot, what we usually recommend is 3 by 3 feet. So that could be a box, that could be a compost pile. And the reason why this should kind of be like the minimum size is because we are looking for a specific internal temperature. And that temperature is 131 degrees. And that is basically the point at which pathogens and harmful bacteria can die off. We can kill weeds, we can kill seeds. But in order to do that, we do need that temperature, internal temperature, to stay there, not necessarily consecutively, but hit that temperature for 14 days. That's like the gold star. And for ideal conditions, like I said before, it depends on your size and shape. But there's a lot of factors that can go into the ideal condition. Like I said before, for moisture content, it should not be anywhere moister than a wrung out sponge. We need enough air pockets, and to do that, you need more browns. So if you're really curious about the scientific process and how people do that, highly recommend signing up for the Master Composter course and or visiting a compost processing site. There are multiple ones in New York City, and you get a really hands-on and visual understanding of how this happens.
Yes. Okay. Also, we can keep answering questions happily. I want to acknowledge that it's 7:02, so we were scheduled to end at 7. I'm happy to stay on personally. We have a couple more questions to run through. Last important note for anyone that's still live is that we will be following up with, I know we've given so many links and different resources that we've called out, so please know that in your inbox within the next day or two, you'll see an email that is going to compile all of those links. So thanks for everyone. We still have quite a few people on. So the next question is, Do you sort the organic waste that comes in outside of removing knives? Obviously, it's from Claire. Um, do you have to go through what comes in order to avoid contamination? Do we have a conveyor belt like they have in recycling processing facilities?
No conveyor belt, unfortunately. Wouldn't that be awesome? But no, we do have to sort by hand. I will say, just to make it clear, that the Ecology Center unfortunately no longer has a compost processing site. We're moving locations, so we're currently not processing our own compost. But when we did, we would actually rely on one, the hands of our operations team, but also volunteers to help us go through that process of removing contaminants in a safe manner. So basically what happens is that we empty out every single container that has food scraps in there, and we rake all the food scraps and just basically visually see what contaminants there are, and we hand pick it out, which is a very tedious process. So it really does make a difference by just ensuring that you're or dropping off the right material and that you're removing those small contaminants that are hard to pick through.
Also important to note, we don't have a conveyor belt, but we do have a screener or a sifter, which we use at the end. So it's something that, like, as you are all in your New Year's resolution and as you're becoming compost experts, you might hear the difference between unscreened and screened, or like unsifted and sifted compost. So essentially, this means that it's passed over, kind of like you can imagine. The best thing that comes to mind would be like a colander, like a bowl of mesh. Ours are usually set up in a tube for the scale that we work at, and it kind of gets passed down, and then the compost is shaking, and then the smaller fine finished compost that we want to actually use and apply, say at a community garden or for growing, drops out, and then some of the larger contaminants, like for example a knife or things like the stickers from bananas, things that might not be easy to catch visually, those would be screened out. So we don't necessarily have a large conveyor belt, but there are tools that help us quite a bit. All right, someone is just saying that at Earth Matter, which is another compost project site, there are a lot of diapers getting dropped off, and they're just joking that some of the material is technically organic. So very funny. Okay, Claire asks, why can't we take all compostable plastics? Is it the size that makes them harder to compost? So I guess the question is, why is it that we, as the Lower East Side Ecology Center, can take BPI certified things, or why can we take soft plastics? But why can't we take all compostable materials, and why don't we take hard things?
That's a great question. Yeah, just to clear the air, um, it can be the size of them, like we said before, the size does matter here, but also softer compostable plastics like bags. Um, I just feel like they have a different type of material that doesn't last as long. If you look at BPI compostable bags, they actually have like an expiration date too. I don't know if anybody has noticed this, but they just decompose a lot faster when we're talking about like utensils and cups in a community scale composting system. They're not going through large enough piles and reaching high enough temperatures to break down as quickly as a compostable bag. So at the end of our composting phase, we still get some remnants through. So there's just too much left over from these hard compostable plastics. But Claire, you make a good point that size does matter. So those things that we can't necessarily chop, they'll take a lot longer to break down.
Yeah, and I guess just like the note for me is that, and Kylene has more experience with the hands-on, but the note for me is that, for example, a compostable fork that feels like normal plastic but is actually made of something that's noted as a bioplastic, it's just so much more sturdy that it would require so much more heat and so much more time to break it down. So we're happy to accept the bioplastic films. That is a massive, massive step in the right direction, and we're like so proud to be able to process those successfully. But just at our scale, we can't accept some of these like things that are noted as compostable, but they're not BPI. And we also just can't take in the hard materials. However, if you are part of the curbside collection, the brown bin program, those are larger scale. They're like more of an industrial processing site. They have more serious equipment. Their process is a little bit more, it's larger scale, so you can obtain higher temperatures, which is just really important. So I won't go on for too much longer about it, but that's the kind of simple definition. Um, okay, so I have another question is, let's see, what else have we got? Okay, so this is from C. Ornstein. Do you know that Downtown Alliance is doing a pilot program with bins in Lower Manhattan? This is referencing the smart bin system. Yes, we are not like directly involved in this, but the Downtown Alliance, they are essentially operating a number of smart bins that are accessible 24/7, as opposed to having drop off that is, from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So it's an exciting program. The Ecology Center is not directly involved in it, but DSNY and the New York City Compost Project, who we do receive funding from them, they are definitely one of the people driving that pilot program on. So, okay, and then perhaps this can be our last question is from Lindsay. If you are home composting, how do you separate the completed compost from new food/brown scraps? Or do you need to have multiple containers going at once? This is such a good question, Kylie. I'll give it to you because I've been speaking for a while, but this is such an excellent question though, and was a challenge when I was getting my sister started with her compost tumbler.
Yeah, Lindsay, this is an awesome question. If you are gonna compost at home, I love to hear it. But yeah, so how do you like remove all that nice brown finished compost from your new scraps? So most of the time, yes, you do need multiple containers. So essentially what you would have is one resting container or your curing bin, which has your more decomposed food scraps or even completely decomposed. So you want to keep that nice and safe and allow that to not be contaminated by your fresh food scraps. And that'll be more of your like active bin. So a lot of people do have two, depending on the size of your location. Some folks like to have three. Three can be a magic number, but yes, you at some point, once you start having finished compost, you'll need another container so that your safe compost can be used without being contaminated.
Yeah, I have two notes to add there, and Belinda, if you want to add anything, feel free. One is that if you're doing kind of using a like a simple one bin system, I know personally the one that I was using at my family's home was a little bit on the bigger side. It was probably like 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, which is kind of, I know you hear the number three a lot in composting. Um, and it wasn't there was no like clean cut line of like, oh, these are the food scraps and this is the finished compost, and there definitely is a gray area in between where things are still breaking down. But essentially what we did was we just held off for like another 6 months while we kept adding food scraps and browns, and then the material at the bottom became more clear, like what was truly finished, so that there was like more of a separation. So essentially let that bin build up, assuming that you have the correct volume for how much you want to put in, and then we harvested only from the very bottom. So that was one useful thing. Um, Another that's like a little bit more efficient and like a little bit more direct is, I know for my sister, she was using a tumbler at her house, and tumblers are like a little bit difficult. Like they have a lot of pros and cons. They can be difficult because there's only one unit, and all of your new food scraps, your new apple core that you just put in, is getting mixed in with your finished compost from like 10 months ago that you've been working so hard on. So I recommended that she use a sifter. It was like really easy to build for her. And even you can just buy one if you prefer to do it that way. And that way she was just able to dump out the contents, put it into the sifter, put it over like a tarp, and then all she had to do is just like shake it for maybe 5 minutes, and then all of that finished crumbly compost was kind of more easily harvested in that way. All right, I do not see any other questions, and people do seem to be dropping off, which makes sense because we are now 15 minutes over our ended time. So thank you everyone so much for joining. This has been awesome. Things went off without a hitch. Thank you all so much to the audience too for being so engaging. We were worried that we were going to have like planted questions and no audience engagement. So this is awesome. We appreciate all of you so much.
Yeah, Belinda, do you have any final notes that you want to share? or anything like that?
No final notes. I'm just very happy to have been here, and I loved how engaging everyone was as well. Loved all the questions. I feel like I learned a lot from both of you, so I appreciate all the questions that the audience had shared. So I was able to learn something too.
Yeah, and those that have registered for this event, you will, like we said before, receive a follow-up email. We would love to hear feedback, good or bad. We'd love to hear it on how your workshop experience was. And then you'll also get some of those resources that we've mentioned before. So stay tuned for that email. For those that maybe just tuned in, Jimmy, I don't know if you want to just put in that last slide with our emails on there, just so folks have a way of getting in touch with us.
I'll put it up right now.
Yeah. Let's see. But thank you so much from me. Again, I'm Kylene, outreach coordinator at the Lower East Side Ecology Center, and we hope that your composting journey will begin today.
Thank you so much, everyone. Happy New Year to you. Feel free again to give us feedback on the workshop. If you loved it, hated it, maybe somewhere in between, you can tell us on the Google form. And we hope to see you at a food scrap drop-off soon. So I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. Again, all of our contact information is here. Feel free to screenshot, and you can reach out via email if you have any thoughts. Other than that, thank you so much, everyone. This has been absolutely wonderful. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, y'all.